Well, good morning, everyone. And Dad, once again, thank you so much for joining us on part two of this little conversation that we've had last week. We talked a little bit about how we can make 2024 a great year, regardless of our circumstances. How are you doing today?
Doing great, John. I can only imagine how beautiful it is right now in Townsville. If you and the Rock congregation can picture it here, we're in Kelowna where it's rainy, turning into snow outside, kind of a drizzly kind of day. Great day to be with you, though.
Well, I don't know if anyone else in the church can imagine that, but I sure can. Um,
I'm sure that's true. Well, just think of pictures of low cloud, rain, and a bit of snow, and that's the image we have here today.
yeah, we're averaging like 37, 38 degrees. That's with humidity, so that's the feels like temperature. And we're going to
Oh
be
man.
just heading out to a park to a picnic for whoever in the church want to join us this morning. So while this is actually streaming, we'll be out in the park for a picnic.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
So today, what I wanted to title this conversation as is living a purposeful life. And we all have like a purpose. So I'm not talking about like discovering your purpose in life, but how do you live every day of your life with purpose?
Hmm.
And specifically looking at, obviously, we're in a new year now, it's 2024. And this is often time people want to turn over a new leaf and people want to make their New Year's resolutions and cut down 20 pounds or 10
Right.
kilos and eat no sugar. And, it's the seventh right now. And most people's New Year's resolutions are probably, unfortunately, haven't made it to this point, but maybe everyone that's watching, I'm sure it has made it to this point.
I'm
Um,
sure.
but that's one of the reasons why we don't want to just focus on like what we want to get done when we're talking about living a purposeful life. I want to read a quote, Dad, by Craig Rochelle,
Hmm.
and then we might unpack it a little bit and take our conversation that way.
Sure.
And so, what we want to do is we don't want to focus on the things we want to get done, but we want to focus on who we want to become.
Yeah.
I'll just read it one more time. In 2024, to live a purposeful life, we don't want to focus on the things we want to get done, but focus on the who we want to become.
That's a
And so,
great
Dad,
quote.
when you hear that quote, does that resonate with you? Is there specific examples that come to mind about focusing on a who more than a do?
Well, I would start by saying I think Craig Rochelle has really nailed it with that quote and with that observation, because I know for me, for a good many years of my life, I would do the New Year's resolutions, I would set the goals, and they did tend to be, if I were to be honest and kind of look back on my life, uh, for a lot of years, my goals would be very inward focused, very focused about me, what I want to accomplish, and so on. And you gave good examples. Here's how much weight I want to lose. I want to increase my run time on my runs. Uh, even financial goals. I want to
Yeah.
hit this goal. And I think the point is, and I think this is what Crochelle is getting at. I think is that those are not bad goals. I
Yeah.
think they're just very incomplete, and they, in and of themselves, they won't get us to where I think God wants us to be, and I think really where each of us want to be. Now, here's when I kind of turned my own corner on this, when I kind of started shifting my thinking. I hope this doesn't sound morbid, but here's how I started to readjust and to realign my annual goals to make it more about who I'd like to be. I started to imagine, what do I want people to say at my funeral?
Mm.
Right? Now, let me sort of work through this because that sounds very depressing, but it's really not, right? Because here's what I realized at my funeral, I don't think anyone is going to say, here lies Scott Cochrane. Do you know that he lowered his golf score 20% a year for the last 10 years and everyone's going to cheer? I don't think anyone's going to say at my funeral, or at least I hope they don't, here lies Scott Cochrane. He increased his personal net worth by 5% compound interest year. Like, not that those things are bad, but that's not my legacy. That's not who I want to be. And then I started thinking, well, what do I want people to say at my funeral one day? Well, I really hope they say, Scott was a good husband. Scott was a good dad.
Mm.
Scott really had a heart to serve others. Scott loved the Lord, and it was expressed in these kind of ways. So when I start to think, well, that's what I really hope people will say about me one day. If that's really who I want to be, what can I do this year to to go on that journey, to start to become that person I'd really like to be one day?
So would you say that the New Year's resolutions, like the things we want to do, if talking about lead indicators and lag indicators, would the do's just be result of the who's?
They could be, and again, I don't think um, that the lowering your golf score or increasing your health, there's nothing wrong with those
No.
goals. People should absolutely be seeking those kind of things. As I said, I think they're just incomplete. And I
Yeah.
think what we want to do, especially now, as you say, at this time of the year, is to be very intentional about, as you're saying, who do I want to be? And then make some action steps towards that.
Yeah. So someone could look at, well, at the end of 2024, we're at the start, at the end, who do I want to become by the end of the year? And then sort
Mhm.
of work backwards from that. Because I think we all have, whether we have put it to words or not, we all have this vision of who we are, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sometimes you're, this is just going through my head, you forget that you've aged, right? You still see yourself as your prime self.
That's
Like
very
you
true.
still see yourself as, that's so irrelevant to what we're talking about right now. But hey, maybe someone needs to hear you're not your prime self. No, that's horrible.
Right.
But we all have this vision of who we are and who we want to become. And Dad,
Yep.
you were sharing this well used term in the business world and the church world is what we want to do is we want to take the vision off the wall and bring it down the hall.
Right.
Did I
And
get
I
that right?
You did. And here's why that really impacted me when I first started hearing this. And again, I'll start in the corporate world or in the business world or the organizational world. Most organizations have a set of values. Okay. They typically they list them out. Here are our six core values of our organization. And everyone agrees on them. And then they'll put those six values onto a nice parchment or piece of paper. They'll frame it and they'll hang it on the wall in the office as soon as you come in. But here's the problem, and I've talked to so many organizational leaders who talk about this. They walk into their organization and there's the list on the wall of all the things they want to be, but it's just not happening. It's on the wall, but it's not down the hall.
Mm,
And so the expression is this is true in organizations. And John, I think it's true for us individually, is how do we take who we want to be off the wall and how do we get it down the hall? How do we get it to live out in our lives every day?
yeah. And I think what we can't miss there is at some point they do have to get up onto the wall. And what I mean by that is you have to understand, you don't have to, but it'd be a good idea to know what are your key values in your life.
Mm,
Like to actually put verbiage to it, because there is going to be a gravitational pull that takes you away from those core values or principles in your life. Because what I like to say is that the things that are most important to you are often not the easiest thing to keep the main thing.
yeah.
Like there's going to be a gravitational pull towards things that are more of a selfish ambition that are going to take you away from this ideal self. And so at some point, I mean, maybe someone's first step is actually getting them up on the wall. But
Yes.
you know what? Just as a figure of speech.
Taking the time to identify and to really reflect who do I want to be.
Yeah.
And that is an important first step to even decide, and maybe this is the goal for this week. I'm going to carve out an evening. I'm going to carve out a Saturday morning or whatever the case may be. And I'm actually going to take the time to consider who do I want to be. And I like the way you put it, John. By the end of 2024, what qualities, what characteristics do I want to see developed in me? What do
Mm.
I want to be true about who I am at the end of this year? That could be a great and a very important starting point.
And that could be fantastic individually. It could be fantastic in your marriage. and it could be fantastic as your whole family. I know you don't need to go into the example, but I know you and mom did that when we were kids about what as a family, what are the things that we value, and you sort of made a course correct, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But Jesus actually, believe it or not, has a lot to say about how we should live our lives, and he is sharing what I deem as one of the greatest sermons of all time, mainly because of the time that he was sharing it. I mean, what I'm about to read some of the Sermon on the Mount,
Mm.
and well, towards the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount. And the reason why it was so revolutionary is because it was so countercultural. Everything that Jesus was talking about was, you have heard it said this way, but now I am coming in and I am saying this is the way that I want you to live your life. And it took some boldness, which Jesus had ton of. And let me just read what follows him going through, blessed are those, and you have heard it said, but I say. So it says, this is in Matthew chapter 7. It says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. So he's talking about the previous, all of the sermon, the topics that he was talking about. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. Now, we all want to be wise, right? We all want to be known. Like when I'm at my funeral, I would love someone to say John was a very wise man.
Yeah.
The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundations on the rock.
Mm.
So even when storms come our way, if we have our foundations built strong and on the rock, and we sort of do the necessary steps to set ourselves up well, we're going to be able to withstand those storms.
Mm.
But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. I don't think anybody wants to get to the funeral and be called a foolish man.
Mm.
The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. So maybe that foolish man just wanted to get everything set up as quickly as he could, didn't listen to instructions, didn't follow the instructions on the best way to build that house. And so from the outside, his external was looking all fantastic. But as soon as one sort of storm came, one thing that was going against him came, the house came tumbling down. Dad, out of all of the Sermon on the Mount, um, is there a standout point for you? Is there something that you've just always like, oh, I love when Jesus shared this
Mm.
point?
Yeah. John, it's such a great sermon, isn't it? It's been often called the greatest sermon ever preached because it's so practical and it's so relevant to what we're talking about today. Because what Jesus is talking about is the importance of your foundation,
Yeah.
and to build a solid foundation upon which you can now build the kind of life that you want to have later on. John, do you remember when you were growing up and we lived on Shannon Court? That was our street here in Kelowna. And if you'll recall, we had a concrete driveway that ran right along the front of the house. And one day I came home from work and I discovered that there was a crack running along the front of the house. And I didn't think too much of it at first, but I noticed that day after day and week after week, that crack was getting wider. And I thought that probably the best course of action was to get some sort of a filler or something to fill in the crack. Now, I don't know much about houses or anything like this, and so I called someone smart to come over and have a look at it. I said, so here's the crack. Should I put some kind of filler in there? And he said, Scott, you can do that, but the problem is not the crack. All you're going to be doing is masking over the real problem. He said, the real problem is the foundation under your driveway. He said, your driveway is sinking.
Mm.
And as it sinks, it's pulling that part of the house away, actually. You've got a foundation problem, not fortunately on the house, but under the driveway. Now, you may recall what we had to do. We had to rip up the whole driveway, and it turned out that the foundation under the driveway had all eroded and rotted away, and we had to redo it. I think of that when I think of the importance of a solid foundation versus just the cosmetics. So again, when we think of the kind of lives we want to build and where we want to go, what we want to have said about us at the end of our lives, a lot of things, although they're not bad, they're kind of the equivalent of just sort of patching the crack.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with losing weight. There's nothing wrong with improving your golf score. But in the long term, that's kind of patching the crack. I think what we want to do, and what I think Jesus is talking about here, is we want to pay attention to those foundational issues. What's really going on? Let's shore that up, because now we're in a position to build the kind of life that we were really hoping that we're going to have.
Yeah, that's so good. And obviously, having those foundations is key for us to becoming the person that we have in our mind at the end of 2024. And it does take some intentionality, doesn't it? It takes some,
Hmm.
it takes purpose. Like you have to purposefully look at and uncover what's going on in your life to
Mm-hmm.
start to build that metaphorical house from the ground up. And that
Yes.
sets up this point. And I got another quote that I'd love for us to sort of dissect a little bit. This one, Andy Stanley says, and it's talking about this whole getting to your intended destination at the end of the year. And so it's because we all have that intention, right? We have this intention to be the best version of ourselves. We have this intention to better ourselves. And as we're listening to this conversation, we have this intention to focus on the who and over the do. We don't want to disregard all do's, but we want to focus on the who over the do. And so
Yes.
it says direction, not intention, determines your destination.
Wow, that's so good.
Direction, not intention, determines destination. So just having this intention in our hearts, in our minds, to be the best version of ourselves, like that's just not enough. If we don't put any wheels on this baby, as I believe you like to say,
That sounds so me,
that's a
right?
Scott Cochrane verbiage. If we don't put some wheels on this vehicle, on this machine, then those
Yeah.
intentions, they're just going to float off with the wind.
Yeah.
And
John, if I could, maybe if I can just share a practical example of that. So, one of my own intentions is, and I've shared this with you, I think before, maybe it was in our previous conversation. I really want to become more others focused.
yeah,
I do find that a lot of my life, my natural instincts are always pointed back towards me, and I really want 2024 to be a year where I'm much more others focused than I have been. But to use your expression, how do you put wheels on that? Like, what
no
does that
wheels on this baby.
the wheels on this baby?
Yes.
That's right. So, in other words, what do I have to be doing every single day to become that kind of person? Well, part of it, we read in the book of James how James writes that James was the brother of Jesus, and he writes, it really doesn't do that much good just to have intentions about something if you're not actually doing something about it. I'm
Yeah.
sort of paraphrasing the book of James. So this morning, your mother and I were out for a walk, and we're here in Kelowna, staying with your brother Adam and his wife, and it was quite early in the morning. It was around 7:30 or so, and we were walking up this one road. We were the only people around. It was again fairly early on a weekend. Most people were not up and around, and we saw someone walking down the middle of the road towards us. And as we got closer, we could tell that this was a young woman, and she was very upset. She was talking out loud, and she was just wandering around all over the place. She was having some sort of an episode. It might have been drug induced, but she was clearly in real trouble. Well, we were only a few steps away from Adams Street by this time, and I have to admit that there was a part of me that says, someone's going to help her out. We're almost home, that kind of thing. But then this idea came to mind that we're talking about. If I really want 2024 to be a year that I'm more others focused, I've got to put some wheels on that baby. And maybe it starts right here, right now. And so, there's nothing heroic about this. This was all, I think God orchestrated this, but we were able to help this poor young lady out. But that's what we have to do. It's not enough to have the value is just on the wall. We've got to get them down the hall. We have to institute daily practices that will put wheels on it, that will
Yeah.
actually turn those intentions into actual steps.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And so direction, not intention, determines destination. Um, what I'd love to do just as we wrap up this conversation is to have three practical steps that the any person can take to help
Yeah,
them take the values off the wall and bring them down the hall
sure.
to help them get to their intended destination at the end of 2024. And
Yeah,
so the first one that I want to talk about is anybody that wants to get to their intended destination have to know what their intended destination actually are.
yeah,
And so the first step that I think we need to take is we need to determine, well, who do we actually want to be?
yeah.
Just very simple. Like just write it down, start journaling, take notes on your phone, whatever you have to do through prayer if you want, but who do you want to be? And when
You know,
you
we
think
talked
about,
on about the idea of maybe someone practically this week wants to take that evening, wants to take that Saturday morning and say, you know what, I'm going to work through this and I'm going to emerge with a picture of who it is I want to be. I love that.
and then the second thing that I think we can do it maybe in that same sit down, once you've, maybe this is before you determine who you want to be, maybe it's after, but what are your top three values? Like for
Mm,
someone to actually know who I know where I want to be. Well, these are what's going to get me there, or this is going to influence who I want to be. What are my top three values? I'll give just a quick example. Um, a few years ago, I decided that I wanted to run a marathon. And I would say that I value healthy living. Like
mm,
I want to be fit. I want to eat health. I try. Obviously, you've got the cheese category. Anyhow, you I wanted to have healthy living, and so I wanted to run a marathon, and I said I valued my physical health. And then I sort of I would have this pull, this tug and pull, where I said I wanted to do this, or I said this was my value, but I had this pull towards apathy, laziness, watching Netflix. So this is who I said I wanted to be. When I looked at my time, this is actually what I was reflecting on who I was. And so there was a disconnect. There was a vision of where I wanted to be, but this is actually what I'm doing. So I needed to have a little bit of a course correct. And I remember one night I was going, oh, I don't have time to train for this marathon. I don't have time while I'm like binge watching a show on Netflix.
right.
And I'll never forget. I just went, wait a minute, what am I doing? And
Mm,
so I turned the TV off. I got in the car, went to the Strand, and went for a run. And it was an intentional decision
mhm,
to not do sort of what I wanted to do now, but to choose what I wanted most in my life.
yeah.
And to make that decision, I had to know what my values were. And so for some, we need to determine what our top three values are.
Mhm,
And so lastly, which sort of brings those 2 points together, you've got your destination of who you want to be, you've got your three values. Now it's time to make a course correct, to look at different areas of your life and see, is the way you're spending your time reflecting your values, and
right.
is the way you're spending your time the direction that's going to get you to your intended destination. It's no secret that if you don't follow your maps on your phone, and you put your intended destination on your phone and you choose to ignore the direction, you're not going to get to where you need to be. And
Mm,
so the blue highlighted line on that Google Maps or Waze Maps or Apple phone maps, whatever you use, you actually have to follow that line to get to where you want to be.
yes. Yeah, so good. And then it becomes the daily disciplines to do what you did. You know, I love your example of saying, you know what? watching Netflix right now, nothing wrong with watching TV, nothing wrong with Netflix, but is that consistent with the goals you've set? Is that consistent with the values that you want to live out? And so you had to make a decision to do something different. And that's really one of the keys in all this. I love your third point on this, to actually make the course correction, to make some changes. And they sometimes don't have to be radical or drastic, but if you start doing the things that are consistent with your values, consistent with the outcomes you want, you're going to see difference. You're going to see change.
And what I would recommend for anyone to do is, once you have your destination, you have your values, you're starting to make your course correct, maybe share this with somebody in your life, to, if you want, if you're serious about this, to keep you accountable, to help you get to your intended destination. It always helps to speak these things out loud, because it's a lot easier to say no to yourself, to say no when you haven't shared it to anybody, and make excuses in your mind. And I'll just wrap up with this. If like me on my run, Dad, I don't know if you've ever said this, but if you hear yourself saying, there's not enough time in my day to get these things done, or in terms of your values or your principles or your intended destination, that's a good sign that you need a course correct. Because
Mm,
my favorite thing to say is that everyone has 24 hours. And it's just very easy to get distracted from your main thing, and to pull away time from what you actually need to be investing your time into.
yes.
Like, we shouldn't be saying, I don't have enough time to spend with my family. I don't have enough time to invest into my marriage. I don't have enough time to spend with my kids. Well, maybe that's the case right now, but if that's something that is in our values and in our principles, it's time to course correct, and it's time to invest our time into the things that we say we value most.
Absolutely, John. Your calendar is one of the clearest indicators of your values, because what you really value is going to be reflected in what you're doing all the time. So you're absolutely right. If a person is watching 6 hours of Netflix, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it's communicating, what it's showing, is that the person really values entertainment above all else.
Yeah.
Well, if that's not consistent with what you really say you do value, you got to make a change.
Yeah.
One of the best definitions of discipline that I've ever heard, it's very similar to what you said. It's doing the right thing when you don't feel like it.
Mm.
You won't always feel like going for the run. You won't always feel like helping the person staggering down the middle of the road. There's a lot of things you might always not feel like doing. But when your values are clear, when your goal for the end of the year is clear, that leads to what you want to do right now over versus perhaps what you feel like doing.
Well, thank you, Dad, so much for being a part of this conversation again. And I'll actually be seeing you in person around May. And I'm sure the Rock Christian family will be seeing you in 2025, I'm sure. And
Look forward to all of that, John.
so thank you so much for the insight that you gave for the last 2 weeks.